Imagine reading a study about life and death decisions in a Swedish migration court. You expect to find a window into the raw human reality of asylum seekers fighting to stay in a country that wants them out. You find a passage describing a young Afghan man who was deported, only to die shortly after arriving in Kabul. It is a moment that should stop you cold, a stark tragedy that demands a moral response. But then the text does something deeply unsettling. Instead of pausing to let the weight of that death sink in, the author immediately pivots. The man's death isn't treated as a loss of life, but as a structural narrative event.
A structural narrative event, which is to say, in plain English, that the actual death of a person is treated merely as a convenient plot device for the structure of the author's theory.
Yes, the human tragedy is instantly dissolved.
It just evaporates.
Exactly. The author quickly overlays the tragedy with dense citations of Habermas and Alexei, dissolving the human cost into a discussion about discursive legitimization and epistemological frameworks. It feels less like an investigation and more like a magic trick.
Right. The researcher takes this brutal reality and just makes it disappear under a velvet cloth of academic jargon.
You start to realize that this wasn't written to expose injustice to the public. It was written to prove the author's vocabulary to a hiring committee. This isn't just bad writing, it is a performance.
And it forces us to ask, when social science becomes a ritual of abstraction, who exactly is it helping?
That opening, which is drawn from an analysis of a real study, it just perfectly captures this core unsettling feeling you get from a lot of contemporary social science.
It's that instant, sometimes jarring transformation of an urgent human reality into a dense theoretical exercise. The tragedy is subordinated to the analytical mode, or worse, it's just treated as an input for the theoretical machine.
That's the stage we want to set for this deep dive. We're going to look beyond just the occasional confusing paper and really explore this systemic preference for theoretical complexity over empirical clarity.
We're talking about institutional forces, philosophical conflicts, and I think most importantly, the perverse incentives that are driving all of this.
Our mission here is to understand why the pursuit of academic rigor so often results in burying the human truth under layers and layers of jargon. It's a performance,
Right.
It seems designed primarily for peers, not for the public good.
So we're aiming to expose the conditions under which knowledge is produced, who it's actually for, and what purpose it truly serves when the language of scholarship becomes so completely insulated from the reality it claims to critique.
It's a really essential conversation, I think, about the integrity and the public relevance of the modern university.
It absolutely is.
Okay, so let's start by unpacking this institutional engine first. Because if you're a young scholar trying to get a job, the pressure to publish is it's immense.
It's everything. And that pressure, it turns out, is directly shaping the language they use in ways that reward complexity and actually punish clarity.
So it establishes a systemic flaw right at the very entry point of an academic career.
It does. Clarity starts to be viewed not as a virtue that helps public understanding, but often as a sign of intellectual immaturity. Or even worse, it's seen as an intellectual liability.
We have this really visceral illustration of this, a story we're calling the PhD dilemma. So picture a PhD candidate, let's call him Elias, at a prominent European university.
Okay.
Elias starts his research with a genuine purpose.
Yep.
He wants to understand why integration policies in suburban Sweden are failing. He spends 2 years embedding himself in the community, gathering this raw, powerful, qualitative data.
So he's talking to shopkeepers, teenagers, local police.
Everyone. This is empirical, substantive work that's aimed at having a real impact.
Which sounds like exactly the kind of evidence-based research that government and social services are desperate for, messy, real-world data.
You'd think so. But when Elias submits his first major draft, which was this lucid, hard-hitting analysis focused on simple, factual administrative failures, his supervisor pushes it back across the desk.
And what's the feedback? Is the data wrong?
No, the warning wasn't about the data at all. It was about the delivery. The supervisor says, this reads like journalism. If you want tenure, if you want to get past peer reviewer number 2, you need to elevate the discourse.
And there it is. That's the critical juncture where the integrity of the research meets the iron demands of the academic hiring machine.
He was given a choice. Speak clearly about unfair rules and probably stay unemployed, or adopt the theoretical code required to secure his employment.
So clarity in that context actually feels like a theft of intellectual value from his own work. He has to obscure it to make it seem more valuable.
He had to translate his own clear findings. For the next 6 months, Elias stopped doing field research entirely. He just focused on this translation exercise.
So what did that look like?
His finding that unfair rules were creating hardship became an analysis of hegemonic normative structures.
Of course.
His identification of confusing laws morphed into an analysis of discursive obfuscation used by the state.
The resulting paper, I'm guessing, was completely incomprehensible to his original interview subjects.
Oh, completely. The very people whose lives he was studying wouldn't have understood a word of it.
But it sailed through the review board.
Sailed through. Because it signaled the correct disciplinary allegiance. He got the fellowship, he secured the path to tenure, but he did it by sacrificing the accessibility of his own findings.
And what that Elias anecdote perfectly illustrates is how the academic system functions as a linguistic filter. It prioritizes the vocabulary of complexity over public understanding.
And the vocabulary becomes less about genuine precision and more about signaling allegiance to these specific, often French-inspired schools of thought that just dominate the prestige economy of Western social science departments.
And that leads us directly to this massive shift in how academic performance is even measured. I mean, over the last 50 years, there's been a dramatic global move toward relying on these easily manipulated quantitative metrics.
The intention was good,
Yeah, right.
Objectivity. Let's use measurable science to evaluate scientific productivity. But what did that actually look like?
Well, we're talking about publication count, the H-index, and journal impact factors, or JOS.
Right, the H-index. That was named after the physicist Jorge Hirsch, and it's supposed to measure both productivity and citation impact.
Yeah, it's calculated based on the number of papers, which is H, that have received at least H citations. And the journal impact factor is even simpler. It's just a measure of how frequently the average article in a journal gets cited over a certain period.
And these numbers now dominate everything. Hiring, promotion, tenure. It all comes down to the metrics.
But they are so deeply susceptible to manipulation, and that brings us straight to Goodhart's law. This rule is just fundamental to understanding how the academy went so far astray.
Goodhart's law. It states, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Exactly. The moment these metrics, which were intended to be evaluation tools, become the primary goal for success, they're no longer reliable indicators of quality.
Because people will just optimize for the metric itself.
Often at the expense of what the metric was supposed to measure in the first place.
And the manipulation is, it's pervasive and it's incredibly detailed. You see this avalanche of substandard, incremental papers that are published purely to boost the publication count.
You see citation cartels. Researchers who routinely inflate their reference lists, or reviewers who request citations of their own work during peer review to boost their own metrics and their journal's metrics.
And then there's the really dark side of methodology, which is known as p-hacking.
P-hacking. Manipulating data analysis until you find a statistically significant result.
Right, often by just eliminating what you call bad data or running endless variations on models until you get a result that confirms your hypothesis.
It's a subtle falsification, and it's driven by the pressure to publish something, anything, that's positively framed.
This pressure feeds into what some people have called a natural selection of bad science, where researchers are just seeking publishable results, even if those results are flawed or marginal, because the system rewards high output and visible positive findings.
And the fundamental issue here is that these quantitative metrics are scholar-centric. They reward output, how many articles you can churn out and how many people cite them, not necessarily socially relevant or impactful research outcomes.
The public good becomes secondary to the individual's metric success.
And that trade-off is often thought of as the conflict between quality and quantity. True scientific progress requires this really precarious balance.
Right. If you prioritize extreme quality, say you mandate slow, triple-blind, mandatory replication studies by independent parties, you minimize errors, but you drastically reduce output. Progress just stalls because of inertia.
But on the other hand, if you prioritize sheer quantity, you accept lower scientific rigor, fewer quality controls, and a less rigorous review process.
So you get a very high number of articles, but the true progress is still low.
It's low because it's offset by the costly setbacks that come with a high error rate and flawed conclusions.
And the perverse incentives we just talked about, Goodhart's law in action, they shift the entire academic community toward that quantity extreme.
So productivity is dramatically reduced, not just by the sheer volume of low-quality articles, but by the fact that those erroneous articles created by carelessness, subtle falsification, and poor review, they have to be read, debated, and eventually refuted.
It's just a massive drag on the entire field.
And it's an acknowledged issue across disciplines. Research shows that scientific output has doubled every 9 years since World War II, yet at the same time, there is this acknowledged collective shift toward quantity at the expense of quality.
This trend also carries these profound ethical costs, doesn't it? Because the system actively selects for individuals who are comfortable engaging in these perverse incentives.
It does. It inadvertently weeds out the ethical and altruistic actors.
You see this in the emergence of a genre that people are calling quit lit. These are articles and essays from successful, public-minded professors who are rationally explaining why they're leaving a profession they once loved.
And what do they cite?
Saturated job markets and perverse incentive structures that reward mediocrity and administrative compliance over genuine intellectual exploration or public service.
And if altruistic actors feel they have to engage in questionable behavior, even subtle falsification or citation rigging, just to keep their careers, well, you quickly reach a concept known as the normalization of corruption.
What's so fascinating here is that this corruption isn't just about a few bad apples. It becomes a cultural expectation.
Precisely. The unethical actions become embedded in the structures and processes of the professional culture. When the structure dictates that cheating is the most rational path to success, nearly everyone starts to view corruption, or at least corner cutting, as permissible.
Or even necessary for survival.
Exactly.
We can see this so vividly outside of academia. I mean, think about the Lance Armstrong cycling scandal. For the 7 years he won the Tour de France, records showed that 20 out of the 21 podium finishers during that era were tied to doping.
And that analogy holds because the system itself, this win-at-all-cost culture in high-stakes professional sports, it created a climate where cheating wasn't really a choice for competitive athletes. It became a structural requirement.
So the clean athletes were either put under suspicion or they just couldn't compete.
Right. And it led to the worldwide disrepute of the entire sport. And the same forces are at play in academia, just with intellectual currency replacing physical performance.
Okay, but I have to challenge that comparison for a moment. Is intellectual fraud, say, packing, is it really comparable to physical doping?
I think it's comparable in terms of the systemic pressure. While the outcomes are obviously different, physical harm versus intellectual harm, the mechanism is identical.
So both systems are driven by high-stakes quantitative metrics, podium finishes, H-index scores.
Yes. And in both, the reward structure is so skewed that the only national choice for survival in the top tier is to game the measure.
That makes the Atlanta Public Schools cheating scandal an even more potent analogy. 12 employees were sent to prison for falsifying student test scores.
And why? Because the test results were quantitative metrics tied to high-stakes bonuses, job security, school ranking.
So the employees were driven by the professional structure to betray their educational mission, just to create the illusion of a high-performing school district.
The common thread is clear. An uncontrolled system of perverse incentives can create a climate where participants feel they must cheat to compete. In scientific research, the consequence is immense, and it directly harms the public and erodes trust.
This corruption is institutional too, right?
Yeah.
It extends beyond just individual scholars. Federal agencies competing fiercely for reduced discretionary funding are also subject to this hypercompetition.
Exactly. When funding rates for crucial bodies like the NIH just plummet, the competition intensifies. And this pressure fosters dishonesty and can lead to scientifically indefensible reports or the silencing of whistleblowers.
Especially if those agencies feel they have to present this flawless, high-performing facade to Congress or the public just to secure their own survival. So if the institutional structure favors output over insight, we've established the money and survival problem. But let's be clear. This isn't just about cash or job security. This is also a battle over what knowledge is. So where did this philosophical preference for dense, abstract language come from?
Well, to really understand the intellectual preference for jargon, we have to look back to this crucial moment in the history of ideas, back in the 1990s. It was known as the Science Wars.
The Science Wars. This was a massive, sometimes really bitter conflict waged primarily in Western academia.
That's right. On one side, you had the scientific realists. These were typically natural scientists, physicists, biologists, who defended the authority of science as being rooted in objective evidence, universal truths, and rational, reproducible procedures.
And on the other side,
you had scholars who were influenced by post-structuralist and critical theory. These scholars, often from humanities fields like cultural studies, feminist studies, or science and technology studies, they argued that it was essential to study science as a social institution.
One whose development is influenced by language, politics, and economics, not just by empirical truth.
Exactly. And the tension was huge. The scientific realists often accused these critical theorists of rejecting objectivity entirely and of using this incomprehensible or, frankly, meaningless jargon language that sounded deep but was actually empty.
And we can see today where the institutional weight has landed, especially within many social science and humanities departments.
We can. The philosophical frameworks have gained institutional dominance, often at the expense of traditional, raw, empirical methods.
That is perfectly encapsulated in something we're calling the conference room shift. So let's visualize a major social science conference today. In room A, you find the old school empirical criminologist.
Okay.
He's presenting a slide deck full of raw data, trends, evidence regarding tangible issues like rising gang violence. He's talking logistics, resource allocation, measurable causes. He is talking about the territory.
But down the hall in room B, it's standing room only. The keynote speaker is delivering a lecture on post-structuralist framings of the carceral state.
And what are they arguing?
They're arguing that crime statistics are merely social constructs used to enforce power dynamics. They're focusing entirely on the language used to describe crime rather than the physical reality of the crime itself. They're analyzing the map.
And the prestige economy has completely flipped. Empirical methods that focus on the messy, objective, street-level reality are increasingly viewed as unsophisticated or reductive.
The institutional weight has tipped so heavily toward philosophical frameworks that the map, the theoretical structure, is valued infinitely more than the territory, the real-world phenomena it claims to represent.
And this preference for abstraction often manifests as a kind of complexity fetish, where dense terminology is mistaken for intellectual depth. Which brings us to the famous Sokal hoax.
Ah, yes.
I remember reading about this in college and feeling, simultaneously enraged and vindicated. Alan Sokal, a physicist, submitted an article to Social Text.
Which was a very highly fashionable cultural studies journal at the time.
Right, and the article was titled, Transgressing the Boundaries, toward a transformative hermeneutics of quantum gravity.
The title itself was just a perfect piece of satire. Quantum gravity is a complex, unresolved problem in physics, while transformative hermeneutics and transgressing the boundaries are high-level critical theory jargon.
He submitted deliberate, salted nonsense. He was mixing absurd scientific and pseudoscientific jargon to see if a trendy journal would publish an article that flattered their ideological preconceptions, regardless of its truth value.
And they published it.
They published it.
Oh.
Sokal then revealed it was a parody. And he and his co-author, Jean Bricmont, they argued that this academic obscurity is often used to conceal either muddle-headed nonsense or trite platitudes.
Or, and this is key, to specifically intimidate audiences into believing the work is profound.
They pointed out this vital principle. When the difficulty of a paper is genuine, it should always be possible to explain at some basic level the phenomena being examined, the main results, and the strongest arguments.
By contrast, these obscure discourses demand something more like a revelation to be understood. They rely on a kind of faith rather than on clarity.
And this wasn't just a critique of confusing writing. It was a charge of intellectual imposture, often achieved through this inappropriate scientific name-dropping.
They compiled a serious dossier of absurd yet authentic quotes from major figures in French theory. Take the linguist and psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva. She used an incorrect definition of the mathematical set $T in a supposed application to psychoanalysis,
without ever explaining what the concept even means or why it would be relevant to human psychology. So she wasn't just using complicated math, she was using complicated math wrongly to sound smarter.
It's a clear-cut case of name-dropping. Likewise, others, like Jacques Lacan, were found writing these abstract, nonsensical math problems that had nothing to do with psychology when they wrote about topology. The jargon just serves as a costume.
It's intellectual filler. It's used to impress an audience that lacks the technical expertise to call the bluff.
Sokal and Bricmont argued that while, 90% of Isaac Newton's writings dealt with alchemy, the rest survived because it was based on solid empirical and rational arguments.
So their point was, if the work of these contemporary theorists doesn't similarly survive independent scrutiny, then their use of sophisticated terminology to impress an audience just amounts to a form of discursive power consolidation.
And the danger, as Sokal stressed, goes beyond the university walls. If the intellectual discourse is poisoned by deliberate obscurity, it strengthens anti-intellectualism in the public sphere.
His core claim, which echoes Orwell, was that deliberate obscurity is profoundly inimical to democratic ideals.
Because democracy presupposes critical public discussion, and discussion absolutely requires clarity in the communication of ideas. If experts can't articulate their findings clearly, they can't participate honestly in public discourse.
But this complexity fetishism, it isn't limited to critical theory, is it? It appears just as forcefully in the hard mathematical end of social science, particularly in certain corners of economics.
That's where we see the phenomenon of complexity denial. Economists often employ what can only be described as convoluted mathematical methods to avoid admitting a fundamental failure in their foundational analytic synthetic approach.
Especially when dealing with strategic social contexts.
Exactly.
Okay, we need to pause and clarify that.
Yeah.
What is the analytic synthetic approach? And why does it fail when people start thinking strategically?
Okay, so think about a mechanical watch. If you use the analytic synthetic approach, you can take the watch apart, analyze the cogs, the springs, the gears individually, and understand their properties. Then you synthesize that knowledge to perfectly predict how the watch will operate when you put it back together.
Right, so economists, early on, treated individuals like cogs and wheels.
Parts of a whole that could be understood fully and independently, and the analytic approach works perfectly for mechanical systems.
But not for social systems.
Not at all. Unlike mechanical watches, society consists of parts. People who are conscious, adaptive, and lose their most important properties once they're separated from one another. The relations between people are not deducible from primitive data concerning these parts alone.
So the theory fails when faced with strategic, interdependent thinking.
Give us an example of that.
Think about a simple game of high-stakes poker, or more formally, the gold sovereign game that's often studied in economics. In that scenario, your optimal action depends entirely on what you think you will do.
You're not a mechanical cog following a set rule. You are adaptively trying to subvert the mechanistic rules that ought to govern behavior.
So if complex strategic problems, like predicting market bubbles or negotiating global trade, if they confound the traditional mechanistic economic models, what happens? Do the economists admit their model is fundamentally incomplete?
Not if their entire career is built on the analytic synthetic approach. Instead of confessing failure, they execute this rhetorical maneuver. They elevate their failure to a higher plane of mathematical complexity.
So they compute meaningless, bluffing probabilities, or use highly abstract, convoluted mathematics.
It's an intellectual defense mechanism designed to protect their reputation. It's been described as a thinly veiled form of intellectual fraud.
And the only practical merit of this dense theoretical complexity is that it confuses the mathematically ill-equipped.
The journal editors, hiring committees, policymakers, it leads them to think the economists solved the problem when they've done no such thing. It allows them to deny the true nature of complexity while maximizing their own discursive power in the corridors of academia and government.
So we've established the institutional incentives and the philosophical preference for obscurity, but let's really hammer home the real-world impact. When that jargon-heavy, metric-optimized paper finally gets published, what is the tangible cost of that inaccessibility?
The cost is policy paralysis, and it is immense. It happens when urgently needed insights addressing crises in immigration, public health, or national security are locked away in a language that cannot be operationalized.
Let's return to the policy world and the story of Corinne. She's a senior policy advisor at the Swedish Migration Agency, and she's dealing with a massive backlog of asylum cases.
And she wants to reform internal guidelines that are leading to unjust deportations. She needs a practical fix, so she commissions a study, hoping for a roadmap.
Corinne needs clear predictions and sound options, and she needs them fast. Her timeline is measured in weeks or months, not years.
She wants an answer that can be operationalized through funding lines and organizational charts. She's not looking for a philosophical treatise.
But what lands on her desk is a dissertation steeped in performative complexity, very similar to that study on the Afghan man's death. The text analyzes the legitimation of decision-making through autopoietic legal systems.
Right, and we have to translate that jargon. Autopoietic legal systems essentially means self-referential rules. Systems that constantly reproduce their own complexity and rules without input from the outside world.
So the text offers these abstract critiques of truth production instead of recommendations on how to allocate social workers.
And the academic language designed for peer approval is completely useless to Corinne. She's frustrated, she's pressed for time, and suddenly she has a policy vacuum.
The research, however brilliant it might be in theory, is rendered inert because its complexity made it inaccessible to the very people who could implement reform.
And the ultimate tragic irony is that the unjust phenomena the author set out to critique remained firmly in place because the critique itself was sealed off.
The research created a beautiful abstract map, but it offered zero direction for the person standing on the ground who needed to drive change.
This failure just highlights this core misalignment between the academic and the policymaker mindsets. Academics are trained to spend long hours getting it right, updating theories, seeking disciplinary consensus.
And they are rewarded for articulating theoretical, empirical, and methodological implications.
Whereas policymakers, they face crises in quick succession and they need good, not perfect answers, and they need them fast. They want practical, specific guidance.
They want to know how to end the war in Syria, not generalizations about how civil wars tend to end across large data sets.
That is such a critical distinction. Academics often lack understanding of policy arcana. The program acronyms, the congressional funding lines, the specific organizational charts that dictate who has authority over what.
When a new fellow comes into government from a university, the first question they hear after presenting their brilliant analysis is often, "This is great, but what should we do right now and how much is it going to cost?"
And the specialization in academia just compounds this problem. Most real-world issues, immigration, war, climate change, are a messy mix of political, economic, and social factors.
Yet scholars are trained in one hyper-focused discipline. Political scientists focus on structure, economists on market mechanics. Policymakers are left with this siloed research that often presents fundamental disagreements or statistical models that relate probabilistic outcomes instead of clear, specific point predictions.
So if the top scholars in a field can't agree on the best way to terminate a war, why should a policymaker who is dealing with an active crisis add academic confusion to their burden?
They end up relying on simpler, clearer, and often politically motivated advice instead.
And the consequence of this insularity is the widely lamented death of expertise. If expert insights are locked behind specialized jargon and siloed research, the public naturally views the experts as out of touch.
Maybe even fundamentally dishonest.
Perhaps. And the intellectual elite, as some critics have pointed out, has torpedoed so much of its own credibility. They often assume that trust in experts is a moral issue, that expertise is simply owed to them, rather than a pragmatic issue that must be earned through transparency and demonstrable relevance.
Right, so when experts dismiss dissenters, whether they're policy advocates or just skeptical members of the public, as kooks, cranks, or bigots, they effectively waive their obligation to reassess their positions, craft stronger arguments, or produce clearer evidence.
They just retreat into their echo chamber of jargon where the complexity protects them from critique.
I think we also need to address the fear element here, too. If the penalty for holding a disfavored opinion within the academic structure can be career-destroying, what we see in phenomena like cancel culture, then trust in the objectivity of the expert inevitably takes a hit.
Of course. If experts are perceived to be holding back or adapting their arguments because of fear, why should the public believe they are offering a complete, unbiased truth?
This just creates a vicious cycle. The inability to translate knowledge into clear, actionable advice persists because the structure of academic promotion still works against policy relevance.
Junior scholars know they need to publish scientifically in academic journals. Policy papers or op-eds are rarely rewarded.
And sometimes they actively harm tenure prospects because they read too much like journalism.
It's highly ironic, isn't it, that policy-relevant work often requires more effort. Writing think tank reports requires mastering a clear, plain language style, understanding policy arcana, and submitting to multiple rounds of rigorous line edits from very senior policymakers.
But if the tenure committee doesn't value that effort, the gap between knowledge production and practical application will inevitably remain. Okay, so we spent the last half hour criticizing academic obscurity and praising clarity. But let's take a necessary and I think highly nuanced pause here. Is clarity always the ethical ideal?
That's a great question, because sometimes the push for simplification can be its own cunning form of rhetorical obfuscation.
That is the essential critical tension we have to address. The philosophers Chaim Perelman and Lucy Olbrecht-Steitika, they warned us that sometimes the clarification of certain notions can bring about the obscuring of others through deliberate omission.
This is where the ideology of clarity can become truly cunning. Since clear prose is perceived as clear when it demonstrates the greatest economy of language, critical context or necessary detail might be omitted.
So the reading audience loses the opportunity to interrogate the underlying claims because the information required for critique is simply not there.
Exactly. The ideology of clarity can be a rhetorical device set in motion by cultural pressures to simplify complex phenomena for rapid consumption. When prose is clear, concise, and simple, it appears neutral or transparent.
Thereby denying its own rhetorical nature as an argument or persuasion.
Right, and this reminds me so powerfully of Kenneth Burke's notion of ingenuous and cunning identification.
Burke suggests that rhetoric can operate without the conscious direction of any single agent. It's just built into the way we communicate.
When a writer's utterance is so rhetorical, so designed to persuade, often through simplicity and clarity, that it transcends the realm of persuasion and appears neutral, it achieves something he called protection by unnoticableness.
Protection by unnoticableness. That's a chilling phrase.
It is. It suggests that clarity can make an argument so seemingly transparent and incontestable that it avoids any critical interrogation whatsoever.
And the writer achieves this by using terms not incisive enough to criticize.
Yes. The ambiguity or complexity necessary for true critical thought is stripped away in the pursuit of a seemingly transparent, factual account. The desire to render language transparent is, on some level, an effort to deny the rhetorical nature of language, monopolizing persuasive agency for the author and cutting off the audience's opportunity to interpret or contest.
We see this playing out all the time in political messaging or corporate communications, where language is extremely clear, focusing on metrics and simple outcomes. But the systemic consequences or ethical liabilities of the action are entirely omitted.
The clarity serves as a conservative political masking device.
And this creates a severe ethical dilemma for academia, particularly for those responsible for teaching rhetoric and composition. They have to teach students to write effectively in a culture that demands clarity. It's the lingua franca of business, policy, and government.
Yet they must simultaneously recognize that the ideology of clarity entails these great ethical liabilities of omission and simplification.
So they're caught between teaching students how to get a job by writing clearly and teaching them how to maintain intellectual integrity by refusing to simplify complex reality to the point of manipulation.
Which leaves us in this profound paradox. Both the proponents of clarity who desire transparency and the critics of clarity who fear oversimplification are ultimately fighting against the same thing.
They're fighting against obfuscation. They're just coming at the problem from opposite stylistic ends.
Exactly. The obscurity of high theory prevents intellectual access through needless, self-serving complexity.
But a simplistic, overly clear style prevents intellectual access through omission and a lack of necessary detail, masking crucial context.
So the goal, therefore, has to be to combat obfuscation in all its forms, whether that obfuscation is the result of unnecessary opacity jargon for jargon's sake, or the result of a disingenuous clarity that strips away all opportunity for democratic interrogation.
It's a quest for complexity that is comprehensible, rather than complexity that is merely performative. We began this deep dive with that brutal image of a young Afghan man who died shortly after deportation. His tragic death immediately reinterpreted in an academic text as a structural narrative event, dissolving the human cost into discursive legitimization.
And that image really encapsulates everything we've explored today. The institutional pressure of the tenure track prioritizing publication count over public impact.
The philosophical retreat that favors the theoretical map over the empirical territory.
And the resulting policy paralysis when insights are locked behind inaccessible language.
The contemporary social science research environment in so many areas is often reduced to a ritual of abstraction, a calculated performance designed first and foremost to secure a position.
The form, the dense theory, the correct citations, the methodological complexity, all of these become more important than the content's clarity or its impact on the real world.
The complexity is often deliberate, the tone of authority is constructed, and the real audience is the hiring panel or the journal editor, not the policy advisor or the citizen.
And the entire system works to select and reward those who are comfortable with this ritual. I think the ultimate finding is that the performance ensures the survival of the academic, but in far too many cases, it ensures the death of useful, applicable knowledge.
The moment the language of scholarship becomes insulated from the reality it claims to critique, it ceases to be a public good. It just becomes professional currency.